It was hard to square his normal past with the savage, frenzied attack he actually committed. The difference between his old life and this violent act was like night and day. That gap highlighted just how complicated things were and how much control Haida really had over him. In the end, the judge gave Stewart 22 years, with no chance of parole until he served at least 15. They credited him for the 2 years he had already sat in jail waiting for the trial. When the verdict was read, Nick's family hugged one another right there in the gallery. They felt a bit of relief knowing justice was done, but the silence broke when a bystander yelled at Stewart. The person shouted that his fate was set in stone and he was finally going to pay for what he did. If this mystery grabbed your attention, please go ahead and hit that thumbs up and follow us for more. We bring you fresh true crime content every single evening. Catch you later. Keep your eyes open. It was barely past midnight on a quiet July night in Melbourne when Nicholas Cameron stepped out of his apartment to take his dog for a walk. This was just his standard nightly ritual. Absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. The streets were silent and distant, city lights glowed peacefully, but a figure was lurking in the shadows, waiting for him. Out of nowhere, an assailant sprang forward. A sudden attack where the sickening sound of metal hitting skin filled the air. Nick's desperate screams for help bounced off the garage walls, but nobody showed up in time, and the aftermath left everyone in shock. This wasn't a random mugging gone wrong. It was a cold, calculated hit planned down to the last detail. When detectives started digging, they unraveled a dark, twisted tale full of manipulation, envy, and double-crossing. Following the evidence led the cops down a path straight to a puppet master that nobody would have ever suspected. Nicholas Cameron, or simply Nick to his buddies, was born on November 6, 1981, somewhere in Australia, growing up with his siblings Gemma and Lucas. After his mom, Mary Cameron, split up with his dad, she eventually tied the knot with a guy named Frank. Despite the family shakeup, Nick managed to stay on good terms with his real dad and got along just fine with his new stepdad too. That marriage brought 5 step-siblings into the mix. Corey, Stacy, Josh, Beck, and Jess. They all blended in to become a big part of his wider family circle. Details about his childhood and schooling are pretty scarce, though word on the street is that he made his living doing landscaping work. When he wasn't on the job, he was actually a pretty solid football player, even if he never tried to go pro with it. But if you looked a little closer, you'd see that Nick's life wasn't nearly as straightforward as it seemed. Rumor has it that on top of his day job, he was running a side hustle, dealing meth in small amounts. As for his love life, he was caught up in a rocky romance with Hyde Boss, a hairdresser who was 3 years his junior. Hyde was raising a teenage boy from an old flame, and the father's death in a car wreck had left her pretty emotionally damaged. To cope with the grief, she battled addiction issues that only spiraled further downward after her ex passed away. Her relationship with Nick was a total roller coaster. Friends said they were always up and down, calling the whole situation toxic. The vibe was so tense that Hyde was known to badmouth Nick, calling him an unappreciative jerk, among other things. Even though Nick acted controlling and could be a real pain, nobody ever saw him lay a hand on her or get physically violent. The drama got even worse because neither of them could stay faithful, with cheating happening on both ends. Nick was sneaking around with a woman named Marn, and it wasn't just a one-night stand either. In fact, Marn was carrying his baby, while Hyde was busy hiding a secret life of her own from everyone. Behind Nick's back, she had built a whole new identity on a private website to connect with guys who were into her particular kinks. She had actually hooked up with a guy online who was ready to do whatever she told him to do. Come early July 2021, things between them were still rocky, but nobody expected it to end in a bloodbath. Destiny had a grim twist in store, though. Late on July 10th, Nick headed out of his South Bank place for a standard dog walk. The second he got to the parking garage, he was jumped in a vicious surprise assault. A stranger came at him, wielding a hammer in one hand and a knife in the other. For 11 agonizing minutes, the attack continued, leaving Nick battered and clinging to life between 2 vehicles. He begged the guy to quit, his cries for mercy bouncing off the concrete walls of the lot. Scared residents dialed 911 immediately, but even though cops showed up 6 minutes later, there was nothing they could do. At 39, Nick was found drenched in blood, his body ravaged by stab marks and heavy blows from the hammer. Paramedics tried everything they could to keep him going, but their best efforts just weren't enough. They pronounced him dead right there at 12:45 a.m., marking the grim conclusion to that brutal fight. Right after the killing, the attacker tried to make a run for it, but he didn't get very far. Officers grabbed him just a stone's throw from the scene and ID'd him as 48-year-old Stuart Heron. Upon arresting him, the cops found he was still holding the murder weapons and, strangely, Nick's house key. He was even holding the dog's leash, evidence that tied him directly to the murder and proved it was up close and personal. In the interrogation room, Heron confessed he'd been lurking for hours to jump Nick, a guy he'd never even met before. He tried to justify it by claiming he thought Nick was pushing drugs to kids and needed to be stopped. At first, Heron painted himself as some neighborhood hero who thought he was doing everyone a favor by taking Nick out. That whole story started to fall apart. The second detectives began digging a little deeper into the case. Ugly new details popped up that killed any idea of self-defense, pointing straight at cold, hard, premeditated violence. Video from the apartment parking lot turned out to be the smoking gun that let cops piece together exactly how it went down. Surveillance cameras captured the precise second Stuart, holding a hammer and a sharp blade, stepped out from behind a concrete pillar where he had been lurking and launched his vicious assault. As they kept working the case, officers tossed Stuart's Land Cruiser, which was sitting just a few spots away, uncovering even more dirt inside that helped lock down the case against him tight. Inside the truck, police found a notebook packed with creepy levels of detail about Nick, proving this wasn't an accident. That notebook had the name of Nick's building written down, along with the specific street address and notes scribbled in the margins about exactly when he was usually hanging around the house. There was also a list of his expensive gear with specific mentions of cash stashed in 2 different safes inside. All this intel proved Nick was being watched like a hawk and that the attack wasn't just some random spur-of-the-moment thing, but the result of long-term plotting. Then investigators checked Stuart's cell phone and found something even darker. A digital folder named Target held a bunch of files about where Nick lived, including a sketch of the apartment layout, pictures of his dog, and even the combination to one of his safes. The level of detail made it crystal clear that Stuart knew way too much about Nick's private business. Stuff like that would be almost impossible to get without help from someone on the inside. The investigation took a weird turn when police found another folder on Stuart's phone labeled Haida, which was full of screenshots of texts between Stuart and Nick's girlfriend, directly linking her to the planning and the actual hit itself. It became obvious pretty fast that Stuart didn't do this alone. Haida had recruited him to hurt her boyfriend. That discovery flipped the script on the investigation, shifting the spotlight to a much darker motive behind the attack. What looked like a random act of rage was actually part of a twisted scheme involving manipulation and coordination. Authorities found out that Stuart, an ex-fuel mechanic who ran a towing and repair shop, had only met Haida about 2 months before the crime actually went down. Back then, people described Stuart as a total loner who was in a bad headspace emotionally, fighting serious depression after his dog died, since that animal was basically his only friend. Digging deeper, they found Stuart and Haida met on a website for people into alternative relationship dynamics. On that site, Haida went by the screen name Hedonistic Siren. Meanwhile, Stuart called himself Slave Pinto during all their interactions on the platform, and the two of them quickly started up an intense, dominant, and submissive relationship. Detectives figured that power dynamic was the main reason Haida could control Stuart so easily, slowly pulling him into a plan that ended in violence against Nick. Despite the website's theme, their bond didn't seem intimate right away. Stuart put his devotion to Haida on full display, bragging online about the many jobs he did for her, which ranged from personal servant to cook, cleaner, masseur, handyman, mechanic, and even her bankroll. He also swore total obedience to her every order, proudly calling himself her slave for life. Cops figured out that as they got closer, Haida started venting to Stuart about how much she hated Nick. She played the victim card hard, claiming her boyfriend made her feel worthless, unwanted, insecure, needy, and foolish. She described the way he treated her as incredibly cruel and emotionally damaging. In text the cops recovered, she called Nick a loser and said she wanted him out of her life for good. Desperate to please his mistress, Stewart replied with absolute loyalty. He told Haida that if she ever needed anything, like a distraction or an escape route, he had her back. By June 31st, while hanging out at Stewart's place, Haida brought up the idea of confronting Nick to run him out of town. They hatched a plan together, and Stewart insisted he could be extremely persuasive. He looked Haida in the eye and told her he was 99.9% sure he could make Nick vanish from her life. She handed over every critical piece of intel he needed, like Nick's home address and exactly where the safe was stashed inside his place. She even revealed the hiding spot for his backup key, which was taped up on a utility pole right outside the complex. Stewart told detectives later that he started stalking Nick's every move, shadowing him in the streets and online, culminating in a 7-hour stakeout at the guy's house on the 4th of July. He managed to slip inside the building that day, but for whatever reason, he decided to hold off and didn't pull the trigger just yet. 5 days later, on July 9th, following a massive blow-up with Nick, Haida reached out to Stewart and finally gave him the green light to make his move. The scheme was supposed to be simple. Stewart would jump Nick right outside his door, rough him up a bit, and scare the living daylights out of him. Haida did her part by baiting the trap, texting Nick to come over and meet her at 12:30 in the morning so he'd leave the safety of his home. She sent that invite knowing full well that Stewart was lurking in the dark, ready to pounce the second Nick stepped outside. Somewhere along the line, the whole setup went off the rails, turning into the savage beating and subsequent tragedy we mentioned before. Detectives eventually discovered that 2 hours after the killing actually happened, Haida texted Stewart to say she wanted to call the whole thing off. She had no clue that Nick had walked out the door almost immediately after getting her invite, unknowingly walking straight into the trap. By the time she sent that cancellation text, Nick was already dead at the hands of the man she treated like her own personal puppet. Authorities had to figure out if she really got cold feet or if she was just planting evidence to save her own skin, but nailing down her intent was going to be tough. Even though Stewart was locked up and looking at a mountain of proof against him, he kept his mouth shut and refused to rat Haida out. Because he wouldn't talk, it took the detective squad almost 6 weeks to scrape together enough probable cause to finally put handcuffs on her. Initially, Haida swore she didn't even know who Stewart was, claiming they were total strangers with zero connection, but that lie fell apart in record time. Police dug into the financials and found a wire transfer for $2,000 that drew a straight line between the two of them. With that smoking gun staring her in the face, she had no choice but to admit they were acquainted. So she changed her tune during the post-arrest interrogation. Haida tried to frame their bond by describing it as a strict power dynamic where she was the master and he was the servant. She asserted that she held the reins while Stewart was expected to worship the ground she walked on, putting her happiness and whims above his own existence. The way she explained it, this type of arrangement comes with the unspoken rule that the submissive party is bound to obey without question. He was basically programmed to do whatever it took to keep his mistress happy, no matter what she asked for. That devotion meant he would do her bidding, even if it meant throwing his morals out the window or committing serious felonies. Her story gave the cops some insight into why this guy was willing to go off the deep end just to satisfy her requests. It helped the investigation team finally wrap their heads around what was driving his erratic and violent behavior. Since she was allegedly pulling the strings that led to Nick's demise, the district attorney formally slapped her with a murder charge. Even though she was facing a heavy felony count, she still had the nerve to ask the judge for bail during her initial hearing. She argued in her motion that she only wanted Stewart to spook Nick a little, swearing she never expected anyone to bring weapons or for anyone to die. Her attorney doubled down on that story, claiming the state's case was flimsy and lacked any hard proof directly connecting her to the killing. The prosecution fought back hard, vehemently arguing that she should remain in custody without any chance of release. They highlighted how heinous the crime was and pointed out the massive danger to the community if she were let back out on the street. They pointed out that she didn't just betray her own boyfriend, but she was the mastermind who actively set the wheels of this tragedy in motion. The state alleged that she fed Stewart vital intel about the building's security protocols so he could slip in undetected. That inside information was exactly what the killer needed to get close enough to launch a surprise attack on the victim. On top of that, they claimed she deliberately baited Nick into leaving his apartment that night with text messages, serving him up on a silver platter. The prosecution insisted that this wasn't just some passive role. It showed cold, calculated premeditation on her part. They argued her behavior constituted direct participation in the sequence of events that ultimately ended Nick's life. The judge sided with the state's argument in the end and shut down her request for freedom pending trial. He stated clearly that, contrary to what her lawyer said, he found the evidence against her to be both credible and substantial. By November 2023, the 37-year-old Haida looked for a plea deal and officially admitted guilt to manslaughter on the 29th. In a previous court session, her attorney argued that she was under the impression Stewart was connected to some dangerous biker gangs. Even with that belief, the defense insisted she never actually gave him a direct order to take Nick's life. Her legal team stressed that she was operating under a crumbling mental state rather than acting with a clear, murderous intent. Evidence presented to the court showed that in the few months before everything went down, things were not right with her. Haida's psychological stability had apparently taken a massive nosedive before the incident occurred. Her life started spiraling downward after a string of heartbreaks, starting with a messy divorce and ending with her ex-husband dying in a brutal car wreck. While trying to cope with the aftermath, she got hooked on hard drugs, a habit that only got worse once she started hanging around Nick. Nick was deep in the game, already a major player in the underground drug trade. Looking at the whole picture, the judge saw that she had snapped mentally when she cooked up that dangerous scheme with her partner to scare Nick. The court understood that her poor choices were clouded by severe mental trauma, specifically the PTSD triggered by her ex's fatal accident. They also gave her credit for trying to keep it together even while fighting those inner demons. She did her best to be a good mom and act like everything was fine, mostly hiding her pain from the rest of the world. The legal team accepted these struggles as real reasons to go easier on her sentencing. The judge pointed out that these facts showed she could truly feel sorry and eventually turn her life around. However, he stated plainly that her hard luck story didn't excuse the gravity of what she actually did. It definitely didn't let her off the hook for starting the chain of events that ended with Nick in a body bag. The gavel came down with a sentence of 6 years and 3 months behind bars, with a shot at parole after doing 3 years and 3 months. She had already clocked 580 days in lockup while waiting for her day in court. The judge confirmed that those days inside would count as time served against her total term. That calculation meant she might walk free in just 18 months, while Stewart started off claiming he was innocent of killing Nick. He was scheduled to face a jury in May 2023, but he flipped the script in March and copped a plea deal. He followed Haida's lead, wrapping things up faster and avoiding the spectacle of a long courtroom battle. Come August, Stewart stood before the Victoria Supreme Court for his pre-sentencing hearing. It was a pivotal moment in the proceedings right before the judge decided his ultimate fate. Prosecutors walked through the grisly details again, stressing how planned the attack was and how savage the beating had been. They mapped out exactly where Stewart was and what he was doing on the night it all went down. Records showed he pulled up near Nick's complex around 8:05 in the evening on July 9th. He first hid by a car he thought was Nick's, but he had the wrong vehicle entirely. That stakeout proved he planned it all and was patient enough to wait for the kill, even changing tactics when he realized his mistake. Prosecutors stated he slipped into the third-floor parking deck at 10:37 that night through an unlocked gate. Once he got in, he tucked himself away behind a concrete column to stay out of sight. He stayed in the shadows waiting for his chance, and when he finally struck, it was fast and brutal. The court heard for the first time that Nick's skull had been shattered in 14 different places. That gruesome fact had been kept under wraps and away from the public eye until that moment. That detail, along with the list of other injuries, showed just how violent and ferocious the beating really was. Stewart's attorney tried to soften the blow by claiming his client was just a regular guy living a boring life before he met Haida. He argued that falling in with her was the main reason he spiraled down this violent path. The court also learned that Stewart had opened up to a shrink about what happened. He confessed that joining in on the crime was the biggest mistake he ever made, leaving the judge baffled by the whole mess. The judge figured Stewart was just lovesick and lonely, hoping for a relationship that wasn't there. He got himself tangled in a weird web of fantasy, control, and serving someone else's whims. For some reason, he agreed to the crazy scheme, even though the judge noted he had a clean record before this.